The memorandum arrived at 7:23 a.m. Eastern Time on February 15, 2025. All military assistance to Ukraine is hereby suspended pending comprehensive review of American national security priorities. Within hours, what should have been routine policy adjustment would explode into the most consequential and transformative foreign policy debate since Trump's return to the Oval Office, forcing Americans to choose between fundamentally competing visions of national responsibility, global leadership, and the essential meaning of America itself. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was in her morning intelligence briefing when news broke simultaneously across every major news platform worldwide. The suspension affected $47 billion in committed military aid, 2,400 planned weapon shipments, and critical intelligence sharing agreements that had sustained Ukrainian resistance for nearly 3 years. Her response would be swift, morally urgent, and politically devastating to administration claims that America was becoming stronger through enhanced strategic independence. But Candace Owens was already preparing her own comprehensive analysis of the aid suspension, one that would completely reframe what Americans understood about foreign intervention, fiscal responsibility, and the proper role of government in an interconnected but dangerous world. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define not just foreign policy, but America's fundamental relationship with democracy and freedom worldwide. The Ukraine aid suspension represented the culmination of Trump's America First 2.0 foreign policy doctrine that had been central to his 2024 campaign messaging. Since returning to office in January 2025, the administration had systematically reviewed every international commitment, military deployment, and foreign aid package through the strict lens of direct American benefit and taxpayer value. The numbers underlying the Ukraine program were absolutely staggering by any measure. Since 2022, the United States had committed over $170 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine's war effort against Russian invasion. This represented more than the annual budgets of most federal agencies and exceeded America's total investment in infrastructure, education, or healthcare improvements during the same period. The strategic implications were equally significant and far-reaching. American military aid had enabled Ukrainian forces to reclaim over 40% of territory initially occupied by Russian forces during the 2022 invasion. Intelligence sharing had prevented numerous Russian strategic advances and coordinated attacks. Weapons shipments had allowed Ukraine to maintain defensive capabilities that military analysts credited with preventing complete Russian victory and potential expansion into NATO territories. But domestic political calculus had shifted dramatically since the 2024 elections. Polling data showed that American support for unlimited Ukraine aid had dropped precipitously from 67% in early 2022 to just 34% by late 2024. Economic pressures from persistent inflation, rising housing costs, and crumbling infrastructure needs had made foreign spending increasingly unpopular with voters who felt their government was prioritizing overseas conflicts over domestic challenges. For AOC, the aid suspension represented nothing less than catastrophic betrayal of American values and global democratic leadership. Her response, delivered during an emergency press conference from the Capitol steps, would be viewed over 18 million times across social media platforms and established the comprehensive framework for progressive opposition to Trump's foreign policy retrenchment. She spoke with visible passion and moral clarity about the fundamental stakes involved. This wasn't merely about geopolitical strategy or alliance management, she argued with conviction. It was about the essential question of whether America would stand with democracy and human rights when under direct assault by authoritarian aggression. Her statistical data presented a stark and devastating picture of what American aid had accomplished and what its suspension would mean for global stability. Ukrainian civilian casualties had decreased by over 60% since the height of Russian bombing campaigns, largely due to American-provided air defense systems like Patriot missiles. Economic stability in allied European nations had been maintained through coordinated assistance programs that included significant American financial contributions. Most importantly, the aid had prevented a Russian victory that would have emboldened authoritarian regimes worldwide and undermined democratic governance globally. Her argument went far beyond the immediate Ukraine conflict to address broader questions of American leadership and moral authority on the global stage. The aid suspension sent a clear message to allies that American commitments were unreliable and to adversaries that American resolve was limited and conditional. China was already actively exploiting the policy shift to argue that American security guarantees to Taiwan were similarly temporary and conditional based on domestic political considerations. Candace Owens had been monitoring the progressive response with strategic awareness that had made her one of the most effective voices in conservative foreign policy commentary. She recognized both the significant political opportunity and the fundamental misunderstanding of American priorities that AOC's emotional appeal represented to middle-class voters. Her response came in comprehensive policy analysis that would reach over 12 million people in its first week across multiple digital platforms. She didn't dispute humanitarian impact or ignore geopolitical implications of reduced American involvement. Instead, she systematically recontextualized what those impacts meant for American citizens, fiscal responsibility, and long-term national strength. The previous approach to foreign aid, she argued with extensive documentation and historical precedent, had created endless international commitments that drained American resources while failing to achieve sustainable solutions. The Ukraine conflict had become a proxy war where American taxpayers funded indefinite military commitment with no clear victory conditions, exit strategy, or measurable benchmarks for success. Every dollar sent to Ukraine, she pointed out with devastating precision, was a dollar not invested in American infrastructure, education, healthcare, or border security. The suspension wasn't abandoning Ukraine, it was prioritizing American citizens who had been systematically ignored while their government focused obsessively on overseas conflicts. Her analysis included detailed historical research on how unlimited foreign aid had consistently failed to achieve stated objectives while creating problematic dependency relationships that prevented sustainable long-term development. Military assistance often prolonged conflicts rather than resolving them decisively. Economic aid frequently enriched corrupt officials rather than helping ordinary citizens build better lives. American interventions have consistently failed to create stable, democratic societies despite massive investments spanning multiple decades. The moral framework that AOC promoted, Owens argued, was actually immoral in its impact on American families. How could it be ethical to send billions overseas while American veterans lacked adequate health care, American children attended failing schools, and American workers struggled with inflation and unemployment? But she also proposed solutions that surprised observers. Rather than completely abandoning international engagement, she called for fundamental restructuring of how America approached global challenges. Bilateral trade agreements that benefited American workers, conditional aid programs that required specific democratic reforms, regional security partnerships that shared costs among multiple allies rather than placing burden primarily on American taxpayers. The philosophical divide was dramatically exposed when both women testified before special joint session of Senate Foreign Relations and House Foreign Affairs committees convened specifically to address the Ukraine aid suspension and its far-reaching implications for American foreign policy leadership. AOC arrived with testimony that was globally aware and morally urgent. She had spent the previous weeks consulting extensively with European allies, Ukrainian government officials, and foreign policy experts to understand the full implications of American retrenchment from international leadership. Her approach emphasized America's unique historical role as guarantor of international stability and democratic values worldwide. She presented detailed case studies of what American aid had accomplished beyond simple military assistance. Economic programs had helped maintain civilian infrastructure in Ukrainian cities under constant bombardment. Humanitarian assistance had provided food, medicine, and shelter to millions of displaced families fleeing war zones. Intelligence sharing had prevented terrorist attacks and cyber warfare campaigns that could have destabilized European allies and threatened American interests directly. Her policy recommendations addressed domestic concerns about foreign aid, creation of transparency mechanisms allowing American taxpayers to track exactly how aid money was used, congressional oversight requirements preventing indefinite commitments without clear objectives, domestic investment programs ensuring foreign aid spending was matched by equivalent investments in American communities. Owens approached the hearing from fundamentally different assessment of American capabilities and strategic obligations. Her testimony focused on the progressive foreign policy establishment's systematic misrepresentation of American interests and unsustainable nature of global policeman responsibilities that had historically overextended American resources. The problem with AOC's approach wasn't lack of concern for global democracy, but failure to recognize that America could only help others if it maintained its own strength. Unlimited foreign commitments had historically weakened American power by overextending resources and creating resentment among citizens whose needs were systematically ignored. Her documentation showed how foreign aid spending had directly affected American domestic investment over previous decades. Infrastructure spending had declined dramatically as foreign aid increased exponentially. Educational achievement had stagnated while overseas military commitments expanded. Healthcare outcomes had fallen behind other developed nations while America spent trillions on foreign interventions. The Ukraine aid suspension wasn't abandoning American leadership, but redefining leadership to focus on American strength rather than endless intervention in conflicts America couldn't resolve through military or economic assistance alone. A strong America that invested in its own citizens would be better positioned to help others than a declining America that exhausted itself through unlimited global commitments. The hearing revealed fundamental disagreements about American identity, moral obligation, and strategic thinking that went beyond the specific Ukraine conflict. AOC believed American prosperity required global stability, and that moral leadership was inseparable from practical security. Owens argued that American prosperity required domestic focus, and that moral leadership meant taking care of American citizens first. As immediate controversy faded, longer-term consequences emerged that complicated both women's predictions. European allies had increased their own defense spending and aid contributions, as Owens had argued, but Russian advances in Ukraine had accelerated significantly, as AOC had warned. Economic impacts on American communities were complex. Defense contractors in multiple states had laid off thousands of workers as weapons production for Ukraine ended, but infrastructure projects funded with money previously committed to foreign aid had created jobs in construction and manufacturing. Meanwhile, geopolitical consequences continued developing. China had increased military pressure on Taiwan while testing American resolve. Iran had expanded regional influence while calculating that American commitments were increasingly unreliable. North Korea had accelerated missile testing while observing reduced American attention to Asian security concerns. Both women found themselves adjusting positions as evidence accumulated. AOC began acknowledging that some aid programs had been inefficient and that domestic investment was necessary for sustained international engagement. Owens started recognizing that complete disengagement created security risks that could ultimately prove more expensive than preventive involvement. The ultimate outcome was that neither side achieved complete objectives. The aid suspension didn't eliminate American international commitments, but shifted them to different regions and formats. The war over America's global role had revealed how unprepared the country's democratic institutions were for governing foreign policy in an era of domestic polarization, fiscal constraints, and global competition requiring both international engagement and domestic strength. The questions that AOC and Owens had raised about leadership, responsibility, and national priorities would continue defining American political debates for years to come. But answers remained as complex as the global challenges America could neither solve nor ignore completely.